"Mom, today is our anniversary. I won't be able to come to the funeral." Those were the first words my son said to me after his father died. Not "I'm sorry." Not "Are you okay?" Just that. 2 hours earlier, I had been kneeling on the kitchen floor, holding my husband's hand while the paramedics counted time out loud. I was still wearing the same gray sweater, stretched thin at the elbows, damp where my tears had soaked through. The chair Thomas fell from was still crooked. The coffee was still warm. The house hadn't learned yet that he was gone. I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting for my son to correct himself. He didn't. I lowered the phone and felt something tear loose inside me, quiet, final. In that moment, I understood a truth I had spent years refusing to name. I didn't just lose my husband. I lost my son. I stood there alone, listening to the refrigerator hum, and thought only one thing. How could they do this to me? If you're listening right now and your chest just tightened, stay with me. Subscribe, because this story didn't end that day. It only began. My name is Margaret. For more than 40 years I was married to Thomas. We did not build our life quickly or carelessly. We built it the way people used to, slowly, deliberately, with attention to details that don't impress anyone until they fail. He worked long hours, often coming home tired and quiet. I handled what remained. And what remained was everything else. The home. The money. The schedules. The emotional weather no one else wanted to track. I was the center that did not demand attention. I knew where every document was kept. I knew which bills could wait a day and which could not wait an hour. I balanced accounts every Sunday evening at the kitchen table, the same table that would later hold too many silences. I planned ahead so problems would never need announcing. People called me organized. What they meant was dependable. Reliability became my language of love. I did not express care through grand gestures. I expressed it by making sure nothing fell apart. That meals appeared. That birthdays were remembered. That emergencies were absorbed quietly, without panic. Thomas trusted me completely. Not because I controlled things, but because I noticed them. If something was off, I saw it before it demanded attention. That was how our marriage worked. Not loudly. Not romantically. But steadily. Our son Evan grew up inside that steadiness. He never doubted that someone would answer if he called. He never worried that mistakes would cost him belonging. If he stumbled, I softened the landing. If he needed money, I found a way without making him feel ashamed. If he was overwhelmed, I made space. I did not keep score. I believed that was what mothers did. When Evan married Lily, I understood that my role needed to shift. I did not compete. I did not hover. I stepped back carefully, leaving room without disappearing entirely. I welcomed her. I adjusted routines. I paid attention to what made her comfortable. First, I was included. Then, gradually, I was informed. Then, eventually, I was assumed. Lily learned quickly how things functioned in our family. She learned that I handled complications quietly. That I did not demand acknowledgement. That I filled gaps without questioning why they existed. She was polite, efficient, always pleasant in a way that left no space for challenge. She also learned that Evan deferred easily. He let her answer questions meant for him. He let her decide how much information was shared. He let her manage communication in ways that felt subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to change the balance. I noticed conversations growing shorter. Not rude, just efficient. Decisions arrived already made. Plans were explained instead of discussed. My opinion was acknowledged but no longer requested. I told myself this was normal, that this was adulthood, that this was marriage, that this was what letting go looked like. But letting go is mutual. What I felt was not release. It was displacement. Still, I remained quiet. I had spent a lifetime being needed. I mistook that for being valued. As long as I was useful, I believed I belonged. And so I continued smoothing, paying, supporting, fixing without asking what that role cost me. There was pride in that. I was proud that the family functioned. Proud that nothing collapsed. Proud that I could still be relied upon. That pride kept me from examining the bitterness growing beneath it. Because bitterness does not arrive suddenly. It forms slowly, when effort is expected but presence is optional. When your contribution is counted but your voice is not. When you are included out of habit, not regard. I began to feel it in small moments. When no one asked how I was. Only whether I was available. whether I could help, whether I had time. I answered yes automatically. It felt easier than asking why the questions had changed. Looking back, I understand something uncomfortable. I helped create this pattern. I taught them that my presence was unconditional, that my support did not require consultation, that my boundaries were flexible, negotiable, invisible, not because they were cruel, but because I never insisted on being seen as more than a resource. That does not excuse what came later, but it explains why it took me so long to recognize it. When you are busy holding everything together, you do not notice the moment you stop being held at all. I believed being indispensable would protect me. Instead, it made me replaceable. The first crack did not announce itself as danger. It arrived as a sentence spoken too quietly to challenge, at a moment that felt too ordinary to remember later, until I did. A year before Thomas died, we were standing in the narrow hallway between the bedroom and the bathroom. The light was dim, late afternoon, the kind that makes dust visible in the air. He was tying his shoes, slower than usual, his fingers hesitating as if they had forgotten the next step. "If anything ever happens to me," he said without looking up, "you'll have to be stronger than I was." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter has a way of pushing fear back into its place. I told him not to talk like that. I said he was healthy. I said we still had time. That sentence, "we still had time," felt solid then. He nodded. But he didn't smile. That was the moment I should have paid closer attention. After that day, small things began to stand out in ways they never had before. Not enough to alarm me. Just enough to linger. Thomas started calling Evan late at night. Not every night. Not urgently. Just often enough that I noticed the pattern. I would hear the phone ring from the other room, its sound thin against the quiet of the house. Sometimes Thomas left a message. His voice was careful, restrained. "Just checking in," he would say. "Call me when you have a moment." Sometimes he didn't leave anything at all. "He's busy," Thomas said once, setting the phone down. "He'll call back." He rarely did. Days passed. Then weeks. At first, I filled the silence with explanations. Work. Marriage. Life. I had used those reasons myself when distance felt easier than honesty. But Thomas began asking questions he hadn't asked before. Did Evan mention needing help again? Did Lily explain what the money was for? Have you looked at the statements closely? The last question surprised me. "I always look," I said. "Yes," he replied slowly. "But I mean really look." I asked him what he meant. He shrugged, the way he did when he wasn't ready to say something out loud. 40 years of marriage teaches you when pressing will only close a door. Still, unease settled in me. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. One evening, I found Thomas sitting alone at the kitchen table with the blue folder open in front of him. The one we reserved for important papers. Statements. Deeds. Records we never treated casually. He closed it when he saw me. "Just checking things," he said. Checking was not his habit. Trust was. I asked if something was wrong. "Not yet," he said. "I just want things to be clear." Clear was his word when something felt wrong but unproven. After that, Evan's calls became shorter, focused, practical. Lily answered more often, her voice pleasant, efficient, already prepared. She spoke as if managing information were part of her responsibility. Thomas noticed. "They don't ask anymore," he said one night, staring at the television without watching it. "They update." I defended them automatically. I said this was adulthood. That independence was something to be proud of. That we raised Evan to stand on his own. Thomas didn't argue. That silence worried me more than disagreement would have. I began to notice the pauses after calls ended. The way Thomas sat a little longer than necessary, as if waiting for something else to happen. I noticed how he stopped bringing up concerns once he realized they went unanswered. He was pulling back. At the time I thought it was age. Fatigue. A father learning to accept distance. Now I understand it was resignation. There is a particular loneliness that comes from suspecting betrayal but lacking proof. From fearing that speaking truth will cost you the very relationship you are trying to protect. Thomas carried that alone. And I let him. Looking back, this was the moment the foundation shifted. Not with collapse but with pressure. The kind that weakens quietly, out of sight. I did not yet see the full shape of what was forming, but the crack was there. Thin, silent, patient, waiting. The change did not come with raised voices or open disagreement. It came quietly through absence. Phone calls that once stretched comfortably into 20 minutes began ending in 5. Evan sounded distracted, as if speaking to me required a level of focus he no longer reserved. Often Lily answered instead, her voice calm and efficient, already positioned between us. "He's busy right now," she would say. "Can I help?" First I allowed it. I told myself this was normal. That marriages merge voices. That families evolve. I did not want to become the mother who demanded relevance or access. I believed restraint was dignity. But what followed was not balance. It was removal. Decisions began happening without my knowledge. Holidays planned and announced after they were settled. Visits shortened with explanations that arrived already polished. Financial matters mentioned only in passing, framed as information rather than discussion. "We thought this would be easier," Lily said once, smiling as if ease were a kindness. Evan stood beside her, nodding. I understood then that easier did not include me. I began learning about their lives indirectly. A lease change, a new work situation, a sudden expense. All of it delivered as updates, not invitations. I was no longer part of the thinking, only the receiving. When I asked questions, answers came prepared. Careful. Complete enough to close the conversation. When I offered help, it was declined gently. That gentleness was disarming. Nothing about it could be argued against. Nothing was openly unkind. And yet, something essential was being taken from me, one quiet adjustment at a time. I remember offering to watch my granddaughter for a weekend. Not because I was asked, but because I wanted to help. Lily thanked me and said they already had arrangements. Later, I learned the child had stayed with Lily's sister. No explanation was given. I stood in my kitchen that evening, folding a small blanket I had taken out of habit, feeling foolish in a way I hadn't felt in years. Humiliation does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes dressed as courtesy. Thomas noticed before I admitted it to myself. "They don't ask anymore," he said one night, staring at the television without really watching it. "They decide." I defended them out of instinct. I said this was adulthood, that we raised Evan to be independent, that we should be proud he didn't need us the way he once had. Thomas didn't argue. That silence unsettled me more than disagreement would have. At family dinners, Lily guided the conversations, corrected small details, answered questions meant for Evan. I watched my son follow her lead, not reluctantly, not resentfully, but easily. That was harder to witness than conflict. There was no tension between them, only alignment, and I was not part of it. I felt myself growing smaller in rooms I had once anchored. My presence acknowledged but no longer required. Like furniture kept out of habit, not usefulness. I was still included, but I was no longer central. And with every softened dismissal, every polite exclusion, something settled into me. Not anger, not grief, just a steady sadness that did not demand tears. The sadness of being managed instead of loved. I said nothing. I smiled when expected. I adjusted as I always had. I believed patience would correct what distance had created. That consistency would remind them of my value. That time would smooth whatever awkwardness had entered our dynamic. I did not yet understand that patience was exactly what allowed the next betrayal to unfold so cleanly. Because while I was waiting, quietly, carefully, they were already building a life that no longer required my consent. And Thomas was watching it happen, carrying concerns he did not yet have the strength to name. The tension did not explode. It tightened. Slowly. Silently. And by the time I felt its full weight, the space between us was no longer something I could simply step across. Thomas died on a Tuesday morning at the breakfast table. There was nothing remarkable about that morning. The light through the window was the same as always. The radio murmured softly in the background. Thomas held his blue mug, the one with the thin crack near the handle that I had meant to replace for years but never did. He was reading the paper, half listening as I spoke about something ordinary I can no longer remember. Then his hand stopped moving. The mug tilted. Coffee spilled across the table, dark and spreading. And Thomas folded forward, as if his body had simply decided it was finished. I called his name once, then again, louder. The chair scraped back. The sound was sharp, wrong. I remember thinking, strangely uselessly, that the toast would burn if I didn't turn it off. Even in shock, habit tried to keep order. The paramedics came quickly. Too quickly for hope. I knelt on the kitchen floor, my knees pressed into the cold tile, holding Thomas's hand while they worked. Machines hummed. Numbers were spoken aloud. Someone said the word time more than once. I kept telling him I was there because after 40 years that sentence felt like the only thing I knew how to offer. He never opened his eyes. When they stopped, the house felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been removed and not replaced. One of the men asked if there was someone I could call. I gave my son's name automatically. 2 hours later my phone rang. It was Evan. I was still wearing the same sweater I had pulled on that morning. It smelled like coffee and fear. I answered expecting shock, confusion, grief. Instead he cleared his throat. "Mom," he said carefully, "today is our anniversary. I won't be able to come to the funeral." He said it the way people explain a scheduling conflict. Calm, measured, as if the matter were unfortunate but settled. I waited. I expected more. An apology. A pause. Some sign that he understood what he had just said. Nothing came. I told him I understood. I don't know why. Habit perhaps. Or shock. Or the instinct to keep things from escalating. The call ended quietly, without argument, without raised voices. I stood alone in the kitchen and felt something collapse that had nothing to do with grief. The funeral passed without my son. People noticed. They asked careful questions. I answered carefully too. I said he had commitments. I said life was complicated. I said nothing that would expose the truth of how alone I felt standing beside my husband's coffin. Grief kept me busy. There were forms to sign, cards to sort, food delivered by neighbors who did not know what else to do. I moved through those days on instinct, performing tasks I had done all my life, even as something fundamental inside me shifted. It wasn't until the house emptied again that I found what Thomas had been protecting. The blue folder. Inside were bank statements I hadn't yet reviewed, transfers that did not align with anything I recognized, amounts too large to dismiss as oversight. $12,000, $9,500, $6,800, $48,000 in total. Each transfer was marked with a word meant to discourage questions. Medical, urgent, rent. My hands were steady as I read. That surprised me. Tucked between the statements was a letter, folded once, never mailed. Thomas's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted slightly, careful, deliberate. I could almost hear his voice as I read. He wrote that he was worried. That money was being requested with urgency but without clarity. That explanations kept changing. That he suspected lies or at least omissions. He wrote that he planned to cut Evan off financially until things were explained face to face. He wrote that he was afraid doing so would cost him his relationship with his son. He wrote that he hoped he was wrong. I sat at the same table where my husband had died and read the letter twice. Everything that had confused me before now aligned with painful precision. The distance. The unanswered calls. The careful management. The absence at the funeral. This had not begun with Thomas's death. It had been unfolding long before. I realized then that Evan's decision not to come was not sudden. It was consistent. It fit too neatly into the pattern Thomas had been quietly watching. My son had chosen ease over presence, silence over accountability, comfort over truth. And when Thomas could no longer object, I became the last obstacle. I did not cry. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the folder. I closed it and set it aside exactly where Thomas had kept it. Pain, I learned that day, does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. And sometimes the betrayal is not the theft of money or absence at a funeral, but the realization that someone you loved had already left long before you noticed the door close. I stayed in the kitchen long after I closed the blue folder. The house continued around me as if nothing had happened. The clock above the sink kept time with the same patience it always had. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street a car door slammed, followed by laughter that felt strangely out of place. I sat at the table where Thomas died. The chair he had fallen from was still slightly angled away. I stood up and pushed it in slowly, the legs scraping against the floor. The sound made my chest tighten, but I didn't stop. I wanted the room to look as it should, even if nothing else ever would again. His blue mug sat washed and turned upside down on the towel near the sink. I picked it up and turned it over, tracing the thin crack near the handle with my thumb. I remembered telling him once that I should replace it. "It still works," he had said. So did I. I lit one candle and placed it in the center of the table. Not for ceremony. Not for comfort. For steadiness. The flame wavered at first, unsure, then settled into itself. I watched it until my breathing slowed enough to think without rushing past the truth. That was when the noise in my head finally separated into facts. The unanswered calls. The shortened conversations. The money moved quietly, deliberately. The letter never sent. The funeral attended by everyone except my son. None of it stood alone. Together, it formed something unmistakable. This was not confusion. This was not grief making people behave poorly. This was a pattern built carefully over time. I thought about Thomas sitting at this same table, alone with his doubts, reading statements, watching transfers, wondering how to ask his own son for the truth without losing him completely. I felt a deeper grief then, not just for his death, but for what he carried silently at the end of his life. Fear. Fear that honesty would cost him love. And I realized something else. They expected me to absorb this too, to excuse it, to explain it, to smooth it over the way I always had. That expectation became clear in a way it never had before. It settled over me like a familiar weight, one I had carried for decades without questioning. And just as clearly, something inside me refused it. Not dramatically, not angrily, simply finally. Out loud in that empty kitchen, I spoke the sentence slowly, carefully, as if it needed to hear itself to become real. "I will never rescue people who abandoned me." The words did not shake. They did not echo. They did not ask for agreement. They landed. I felt no surge of power, no rush of righteousness. No desire to call anyone or confront anything. Only clarity. I saw my life laid out plainly. Years spent anticipating other people's needs before they were spoken. Making myself smaller so situations stayed manageable. Confusing peace with silence. Confusing love with endurance. That version of me had been dependable. She had been generous. She had also been exhausted. I understood then that strength does not always look like holding on. Sometimes it looks like releasing what has already let go of you. I sat there until the candle burned low. The flame shrank, flickered once, and went out on its own, leaving a thin line of smoke that disappeared almost immediately. The room returned to its ordinary shape. But I did not. Grief was still there. It would always be there. Grief does not leave just because clarity arrives. But beneath it, something firm had formed. Not anger. Not revenge. A boundary. I gathered the papers neatly. I placed Thomas's mug back in the cupboard where it belonged. I wiped the table clean and turned off the light. That night, when I went to bed, I did not wait for the phone to ring. I did not brace myself for explanations, apologies, or requests. And for the first time since my husband died, I slept without preparing to carry something that was never mine to hold. I woke before sunrise the next morning. The house was still but no longer tense. Not suspended in shock or waiting for instruction. It felt settled, as if something difficult had already been decided and accepted. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet, and realized I was no longer bracing myself. There was nothing left to anticipate. The truth had already arrived. I got out of bed and made tea instead of coffee. Coffee had always been Thomas's choice, loud and bitter and necessary. Tea felt more deliberate. I carried the cup to the kitchen table and watched the light slowly move across the wall, passing the calendar Thomas had never turned to the next month. His handwriting was still there. Circles around dates that mattered. Small notes in the margins. Evidence of a man who planned for a future he would not see. At 9 o'clock exactly, I made the call. Our lawyer answered on the second ring. He had worked with us for years. He knew our habits, our caution, our preference for decisions made cleanly and without spectacle. "I need to make changes," I said. He did not ask why. That alone told me he understood more than I was prepared to explain. We spoke calmly, methodically. I did not tell him about the letter. I did not describe the funeral or the phone call that followed. I simply told him what needed to be done. The house would be placed in a trust, the savings restructured, the remaining accounts secured. No shared access, no assumptions, no informal arrangements. None of it would pass to my son. Instead, everything would be held for my granddaughter. I chose her because she was innocent of this, because she had never learned to trade silence for comfort or presence for convenience, because one day she would need stability more than explanations, and protection more than inheritance drama. The lawyer paused. He asked if I was certain. Yes, I said. The word came easily. Not rehearsed. Not forced. Certain was exactly what I was. When the call ended, I did not feel relief, or fear, or triumph. I felt alignment, as if something inside me had finally stopped resisting itself. I spent the rest of the morning gathering documents, deeds, statements, old insurance papers I hadn't looked at in years. I moved carefully, respectfully, like someone closing a chapter without tearing the pages. I found photographs of Thomas tucked into places I hadn't checked in years. Him standing in the yard. Him holding Evan as a child. Him at the kitchen table, smiling without knowing why. I kept one. I returned the rest. This was not erasure. It was order. That evening Evan called. The phone lit up on the counter. His name appeared the way it always had. Familiar. Automatic. For years that name had meant responsibility, anticipation, adjustment. I watched it ring. I did not feel anger. I felt finished. Not finished with love, but finished with explaining myself to someone who had already decided what they needed from me. The call went unanswered. Later a message arrived. He said we needed to talk. That things felt misunderstood. That grief complicated everything. That we were still family. I listened to the message once. Then I deleted it. He had made his choices quietly, without consultation. I was allowed to do the same. That night before bed, I locked the front door. A habit I had never needed before. I noticed how steady my hands were as I turned the key. I was not acting out of anger. I was acting out of clarity. For years, I had been the bridge everyone crossed without noticing the water below. I had reinforced it, repaired it, widened it when needed. That night I stepped aside. Nothing collapsed. The house stood. The future remained. And I finally understood that choosing myself was not an act of abandonment. It was an act of truth. The first call came 3 days later. I knew it would. Evan sounded confused, not angry. As if something familiar had suddenly stopped responding, and he was waiting for it to correct itself. Mom, he said, there's a problem with the account. I can't access it. He said it lightly, as if the word problem meant inconvenience, not consequence. There's no problem, I replied. Things have been changed. Silence followed. I imagined him looking at Lily, her face tightening slightly as calculations replaced assumptions. What do you mean changed? He asked. I mean exactly that, I said. You weren't meant to be surprised. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Surprise implied expectation. An expectation revealed entitlement. He tried to laugh it off. Said paperwork took time. Said banks made mistakes. Said we could clear it up quickly if needed. I didn't argue. The next call came from Lily. Her voice was different than before. Softer. More careful. She spoke the way people do when approaching something they believe still belongs to them. We're under a lot of stress, she said. Everything's happened so fast. I listened without interrupting. She explained expenses. Timing. Pressure. She said they had never meant to hurt anyone. That things just escalated. That they assumed arrangements would continue as they always had. That word, assumed, settled heavily in the space between us. They had assumed my silence meant approval. My consistency meant permission. My love meant access. After that, the tone shifted. Evan left a message saying he hadn't realized how things looked from my side. That grief makes people distant. That we should talk things through when emotions settled. I deleted it. Not because it was cruel. Because it was incomplete. They spoke as if this were sudden. As if Thomas's death had disrupted something that was otherwise healthy. As if time would restore what had been quietly dismantled long before. Access disappeared first. Then predictability. A payment didn't go through. A card declined unexpectedly. A flight was missed because someone assumed I would cover it as I always had. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just friction where ease once lived. I heard through relatives that things were tense. That Lily was overwhelmed. That Evan felt caught in the middle. That they didn't understand why I was being so distant, so cold. I wasn't cold. I was finished negotiating my worth. One evening, Evan came to the house without calling. I saw him through the window before I opened the door. He stood there uncertainly, hands in his pockets, like someone arriving without invitation. "We didn't think you'd do this," he said. "I know," I replied. He waited. For justification. For explanation. For the version of me who softened moments so others wouldn't feel discomfort. She did not appear. "I just wanted you to understand," he said. "I do," I answered. And I meant it. I understood that they had built their stability on my predictability. That when it disappeared, they were forced to adjust, not emotionally but practically. That was the part they hadn't prepared for. I wished him well. I closed the door gently. No shouting. No accusations. No dramatic farewell. Just a boundary enforced through consistency. Consequences do not need cruelty to be effective. Sometimes they arrive as closed accounts, unanswered calls, and the quiet realization that access is not the same as love. And once that realization settles, there is no argument left to make. The house found a different rhythm after that. Not emptiness. Not silence meant to punish or provoke. Just a steadiness that had been missing for longer than I realized. There were no longer pauses waiting to be filled. No constant readiness for interruption. Each room existed for itself, not for who might need something next. The mornings were the first to change. I stopped waking with the instinct to check my phone. The reflex faded slowly, like a habit unlearned. Instead, I listened to the house wake up. Pipes shifting. Birds settling on the fence. Light moving across the floor in patterns I had never noticed before because I had always been rushing toward someone else's urgency. My granddaughter began staying with me more often. First it was practical. Her school was closer. The schedule made sense. But soon it stopped feeling temporary. Her shoes by the door. Her backpack on the chair. Small signs of presence that did not demand explanation. She belonged here. We shared the kitchen table in a way that felt natural, unforced. She did her homework where I once balanced accounts and planned budgets meant to stretch beyond comfort. Sometimes she asked about her grandfather. I told her simple truths. That he was steady. That he noticed details. That he kept his word even when it was inconvenient. I did not explain absence. Children understand more from tone than from reasons. Afternoons opened up. Without the constant pull of being needed elsewhere, I rediscovered time. I walked instead of drove when I could. I noticed neighbors I had waved to for years but never spoken with. I learned their names slowly, without urgency. I volunteered twice a week at the local library. Nothing impressive. Just shelving books, helping children find stories they liked, answering questions that did not carry expectation. It felt good to be useful without being required. That distinction mattered more than I expected. In the evenings, I cooked for myself without adjusting for anyone else's preferences. I ate slowly. I left dishes until morning without apology. I rested when I was tired instead of pushing through for the sake of keeping things running. I began choosing. Some nights, I lit the same candle I had used the day clarity arrived. I did not sit in grief anymore. I sat in reflection. I spoke to Thomas then quietly, telling him about the day. What I noticed. What I was learning now that I was no longer organizing my life around anticipation. I imagined him listening the way he always had. Patient. Present. Relieved that I was no longer carrying everything alone. Grief did not disappear. It softened. It stopped demanding explanation and began allowing memory. I missed Thomas deeply, but the missing was no longer sharp. It was folded into my days without tearing them open. I missed the idea of my son more than the reality of him. That distinction hurt, but it also clarified. I stopped waiting for reconciliation shaped by guilt or necessity. I accepted that some relationships do not end with arguments. They thin quietly until what remains is memory, not connection. And that acceptance brought relief. Not excitement. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes from knowing your time is finally yours. That your worth is no longer measured by how much you absorb for others. That your days belong to you, not to expectation or obligation. I noticed my body change. My shoulders rested lower. My breath settled. The constant readiness eased. I slept more deeply. I laughed more easily, surprised sometimes by the sound of it. I had not hardened. I had stabilized. The house was quiet now. Not heavy. Honest. Balanced. And in that balance I found something I had not felt in years. Peace that did not require permission. Peace that did not need to be earned. Peace that stayed even when the phone did not ring. For the first time in my life, I was not living in preparation for someone else's needs. I was living. For most of my life I believed love meant endurance. It meant staying quiet when something hurt. Staying available even when I was tired. Staying useful so I would not become invisible. I believed that if I carried enough, gave enough, absorbed enough, I would always belong. I was wrong. What I learned slowly and without drama is that love without respect turns into obligation. And obligation carried too long erases the person who bears it. I did not stop loving my son. I stopped disappearing for him. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand apologies or explanations. I did not punish anyone. I simply chose to live forward instead of remaining suspended in what could no longer be repaired. Grief still walks beside me. It always will. But it no longer dictates my decisions. It no longer convinces me that silence is kindness, or that sacrifice guarantees loyalty. Sometimes love is not about forgiveness. Sometimes it is about truth. About recognizing when your presence is expected but your voice is not. When your support is assumed but your dignity is negotiable. And deciding quietly, firmly to remain present in your own life. I did not slam the door in anger. I walked forward. I chose clarity over comfort, boundaries over habit, self-respect over approval. And in doing so, I found something steadier than reconciliation. I found peace. If this story felt familiar, if it touched something you have carried quietly for years, know this. Choosing yourself is not cruelty. It is survival with integrity. If this spoke to you, stay with me. Subscribe to hear stories where silence becomes strength. And remember, peace is not something you earn by suffering. It is something you are allowed to keep.